Pathwork lecture number 132, Function of the Ego in Relationship to the Real Self. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to bring them up or suggest them at any time. I've been referencing these as questions, but I know that sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they're a request for the discussion to go in a different way or a contribution. So I certainly don't mean to diminish your participation by presuming that I'm the wonderful know-all and be-all of all things.
Jan,
yes.
I couldn't access that 132. It was one that I didn't have, but I did find in the Pathwork of Self-Transformation by Eva is that connection between ego and universal power. Is that pretty close?
That's pretty close, Harry. I think that'll do. And you've reminded me of something, thank you. Function of the Ego is one of the few tapes that are commercially available. It's the actual tape of Eva giving the lecture. So it can be purchased from the Pathwork Foundation. And they used to sell it in cassette tape, and now they're selling it as a download. So if you have trouble accessing the link, let me know. But it's interesting when I present a lecture that you can actually get a tape of Eva actually presenting the lecture back 30, 40 years ago. So the lecture starts out with one of the first paragraphs in it saying that the goal of our work here, as far as man is concerned, can only be one thing, and that is in becoming the real self. And then the guide goes on to explain what the real self is. And explains that the real self is all that is good, all that is creation, all that is joy, all that is divine. And that the real self is creation itself and is nature. And I notice when I read the lectures that I hiccup on certain phrases. And those hiccups are useful because it tells you that you have a question or a glitch or there's an issue that you may have with the phrase or the idea underneath the phrase more accurately. And I had a glitch when I read this paragraph in the phrase, "For nature can be wholly trusted." And the reason I glitched is, first the guide says that my job is to access my real self, not the real self, but my real self. And that my real self is nature. And then the guide says that nature can be fully trusted. So if you take out the intermediate parts of the sentences, what the guide is saying is that I, or you, can be completely trusted. So just take that in for a moment as a possibility. That you in your true nature, in your innermost self, can be wholly and completely trusted. And that your task here on this planet is to find that place, to find that inner self. And then the guide moves on to talk about the function of the ego as a place that is supposed to bring us to the real self, the inner self. Now, I learned a little piece of reality one time that I am fascinated by, and I found it to be a good analogy for ego. And that is ego as bone. And the little piece of trivia that I uncovered one time was that there are only two land-based animals that have no bone, skeletal structure, external or internal, of any kind. One is a slug, and the other is a leech. That every other animal on the land, and by animal I even looked that up, at a multicellular organism, every other animal on the planet has some form of structure to support it. And the other piece of trivia that went with that was that without bone structure, an animal can only grow so large. So interestingly, slugs and leeches obviously are quite small. And that even worms, because I challenged that, and I said, well, what about worms? And apparently worms have a hydrostatic membrane that they puff up to act as support for them as they move around. And they're calling that an exoskeleton. So even worms have some kind of structure to support their body mass. Now, why am I boring you with this science fact? Because the ego, to some extent, is the bones, is the skeletal structure, or can be seen as that, of who we are. And what bones do is they may allow an organism to become large and to move and to run, to fly and to glide, but they also break, they're subject to joint damage, and they bring on all the other problems that bone and ligament structures do. So the ego being seen the same way, what the guide is saying is that you need the ego, even though it naturally over or underdevelops periodically. Okay? So a smoothly functioning ego is like a smoothly functioning skeletal structure. It supports you, it allows you to do what you need to do. At one point, the guide describes the ego as arms that reach out to receive or to give. And the trick with the ego is that once it has done that, it needs to let go. So a smoothly functioning ego, a healthy ego, will assist you in doing something. It will assist you in becoming or being or giving or doing, and then relax and basically wait for its next job, its next assignment, its next chore or task. So then again, the guide says that the only problems we have here on the earth have to do with an underdeveloped or overdeveloped ego. So if you can imagine there's one cartoon that a certain teacher uses, and she uses a car, like a little Volkswagen. And for the underdeveloped ego, she shows this poor, sad thing with no tire pressure, and its fender falling off, and dents in its side, and it's just exhausted, one of those little cartoon exhausted cars with its tongue hanging out, as if a car had a tongue. And that is an underdeveloped ego, and it's not able to transport your real self to where you need to go. And in terms of an overdeveloped ego, that was represented by a car that's way too big for its wheels. So far too much body structure, far too much, carrying way more than it was designed to carry, puffed up and grandiose, so that it can barely move along and function. And that would represent an overdeveloped ego. So with either a underdeveloped or an overdeveloped ego, you're either going to not be able to do enough of your task, or you're going to wind up with the ego taking on more chores or getting in the way of what you need to do. At some point, the question would be, what does the ego do? What are its chores? I've always thought of the ego like a bureaucrat. I've always thought of it like a very good administrative secretary. So that if you need something done, the ego says, oh, I know where that is. So if you want to go out, your ego figures out where your purse is or your coat. It figures out what you need to have with you. It knows where the keys are, or it can find the keys. when it goes out to start the car, it understands the process and the procedure of the car. It understands the street, the maps, the directions. It understands where you're going and where you have to be and why you have to be there and how to get you there on time. And these are all procedural matters. It has nothing to do, perhaps, with what you're going to do once you get there. So in the lectures, what the guide lists as functions of the ego, and this comes from lecture 158, which is the ego's cooperation with or obstruction to the real self. The guide lists that the ego can memorize, it can learn, it can collect creative knowledge, it can repeat, it can copy, remember, sort out, select, make up the mind, move towards a different direction. These are all things that the ego can do. But what the ego cannot do, it can imitate, but it cannot actually do, is to feel or to produce deep feelings. The ego cannot deeply experience. These are what the real self actually does, to some degree or another. The ego cannot give a deep flavor to living. The ego cannot deeply know or be creative. The ego cannot be spontaneous. It can't reconcile the apparent differences or opposites. Interestingly, the guide says the real self can always have answers. That doesn't mean it knows exactly what to do, but that the real self always has a sense of where we are and why we are there, whereas the ego may not. Because the ego is reality-based. It's looking around the room saying, why am I here? Whereas the real self may actually have a sense, I'm here for a reason, my conscious mind may not know it, but I'm just going to hang out here and find out what's going on. And the real self also renders man more alive and more fulfilled. Now, the one thing that the ego can do that the real self cannot do is to die. So the real self being nature, being creation itself, whether your body dies or not, your real self cannot die. But there is such a thing as an ego death. Because the ego is reality-based and it is deciding who it is based on what is around it. And when circumstances change dramatically, that's what we call an ego death. So for instance, if you were in charge of something, if you were a supervisor or a manager, or if you owned a business, and then circumstances changed and you wound up being a clerk or working for somebody else, that's what we would describe as there would have to be an ego death there, because there would have been a perception of being in charge, of being in control, of knowing what you were doing and being successful. And under the new circumstances, you would have to consider that you may not have all the answers. You would perhaps need to see reality from a different perspective. And this is what the guide very often calls an ego death in the lectures. And in this dying process, in this need to change, where the ego needs to give up its perceptions and find a new set of perceptions, this is what the guide consistently calls the death of the ego. So to some extent, that is part of the function of the ego. Now, if you turn to psychology, there's a similarity there. It's not quite the same, but it's similar. And that is that in Freudian psychology, the ego's functions are described as reality testing. In other words, the ego is supposed to have a sense of what is real. The ego has impulse control based on circumstance. The ego has judgment, object relation, thought processes, defensive functioning, and synthesis. And by synthesis, what they mean is that synthesis enables the individual to think, feel, and act in a coherent manner. So synthesis is the process of the ego to recognize changing circumstances and adapt. Again, this definition of ego in a Freudian sense is very similar to the pathwork definition of ego. The pathwork just goes one step further. The Freudian psychology does not ask the question, why is there an ego on a spiritual level? And the guide's answer, once again, is that the function of the ego, the purpose of the ego, is to allow the real self to be accessed. So there's a paradox with the ego. And that's where the guide describes that first you reach out. Whoops, I'm going to back up a second, sorry. The guide describes that as a child, the child is the real self. The child, when born, has no problem interacting with the world in a natural, creative manner. But of course that changes over time as it is acclimated and culturalized and socialized. So that the ego is necessary to allow the child to learn how to manage the functions in life. So if you think in terms of computers, you can think of the ego as the input-output manager. It decides what you're allowed to say and not insult or upset someone. And it structures what you hear and where that belongs. So in a joke sense, if somebody says, go jump in the lake, the ego says they don't mean that. They mean mind your own business or get out of my way. They do not mean go find a lake and jump in it. That's part of what the ego does, is it interprets reality and decides what we're supposed to do next. And a child's process with this is lengthy, of course. So you first reach out with your ego faculties. And the paradox is that what the guide says is only when the ego is sufficiently developed can it be adequately dispensed with. So you're building your ego and you're learning to live in the real world and you're learning to manage with all the factors that come in and out and the people that come in and out of your lives and the circumstances that you're dealing with. And on a spiritual basis, at some point, you're invited to dispense with the ego. And the dilemma there is that the ego has a sense of self. It almost acts sometimes like a separate being. And once you've got, if you play with the idea of little figures in, you've got my real self and my higher self and my lower self and my ego and my objective observer and my this and my that. It gets very crowded in there sometimes. But if you think of the ego as having a persona and deciding what reality is and deciding that it's very, very competent to decide what comes in and what goes out, that at some point the ego is going to become really upset at the idea that it's no longer needed. So the paradox is that you build this mechanism like you build a skeleton to a place where you no longer need it and where it actually can get in the way. It can retard your process at some point. So the ego is necessary to change its own mind and intent. It's like the ego has to do surgery on itself. And it has to decide to some degree when to leave, when the job is done. And that takes a lot of maturity. So sometimes the lecture titles are really, really good in terms of being when you read the whole title of the lecture, it kind of gives you the entire lecture. So if we repeat the name of the primary lecture that I'm using as a reference, the function of the ego in relationship to the real self. That's what this lecture refers to. Now there's a lot of different lectures on ego, and when I put up the study materials on the website, I referenced about 6 or 7 of them. I worry sometimes because I think people are going to freak out when they see that much material. But I'm not trying to say that you need to read all that material. But sometimes we get different ahas from different lectures. So I collected all the lectures specifically on the ego, or primarily on the ego, because I wanted to go through them and kind of get a feel for the subject, an all-around feel for the subject. So the last piece, which when I work on the lectures, I learn something. It's why I love to teach, because in teaching the material, I have to go deeper in it, force myself to go deeper than I might if I was just reading it. And I very often get some insights. And this lecture in particular gave me one of the strongest insights I've gotten in many, many months. And it happened when I got to the section on self-punishment and the fact that the quote is, "Not only your body, but your life conditions are a result of what you are." Now let me introduce that a second, because the lectures aren't easy and sometimes you actually need to read 3 of them to really get some of these points. They're a little obtuse sometimes. Brilliant, but difficult to understand. And what the guide was introducing at this point is that as a human being with an ego, that from a spiritual perspective, once again, going beyond psychology and going beyond human social and cultural ideas, that the personality exists before the body exists. Now, I've taught this many, many times before, and the way I teach it is that I imagine that you've got, when you're in the reincarnation chamber and you're about to manifest into this life, and you have your life task and your life plan and all these ideas, that you go into a special room and there is a wardrobe room. And you get to choose your skeletal structure. You get to choose your skin color. You get to choose the shape of your nose. You get to choose your eyes. You get to choose your talents and skills, and whether you're going to be clerically oriented or not, whether you're going to have big feet or small feet, whether you're going to have athletic abilities or simply be very, very passive and undeveloped on a muscular level. And I get this from the guide, but this is my imagining, that you go into this room and choose. And yet, in this lecture, I was startled by the particular phrasing, that the personality exists before the body. And the reason this matters to me is that what I feel the guide is saying is that you have developed not only your body, but your life based on your personality, so that you would meet your real self. And that the imperfection of the personality, the difficulties that the ego encounters in life, are not an accident. They are the invitation itself. I hope this doesn't sound too odd. But in other words, the difficulties that you have in life represent the very part of you that needs to grow and develop. And that if your personality exists before your body, then your body reflects something that you need to learn, something that you need to dive into, something that you need to really accept on a deep and profound level. And it goes on to talk about self-punishment is a substitute for giving up the guilt-producing attitudes. So for those of us who are not 1000% happy with their body, I translate this to mean that if you do not like your body, and if that's not your issue, your place in life, your skills and talents, your ability to manifest a relationship, your ability to manifest a profession, anything about your life that you don't like was developed by you so that you could learn something. And that your dislike of it, which is a form of self-punishment, so not liking yourself for who you are, is a way of demeaning or critiquing yourself. That self-punishment is a substitute for giving up the guilt-producing attitudes. And what this meant to me was that my critiques of myself as a human being occupy my time where I could be spending my time dealing with what I have to learn. And the other place the guide says this, if I can find it, sometimes I write all these notes and I can't find them. Oh, here it is. If you say often enough how bad you are, if you suffer enough from your guilt, you feel that you are still a nice person in spite of maintaining what is in actuality of no conceivable advantage to you or to others. And the way I read that is that critique of yourself, instead of simply working on the issues that are in front of you, doesn't serve you, and it doesn't serve the rest of us. And what this phrase did was it pulled me up personally and made me realize that my critiques of myself are to some extent selfish. They are to some extent infantile. That from a larger spiritual level, I gave myself these attributes specifically so I could bring myself to a realization of my real self. And that's my job. I'm not talking about self-analysis because the guide, the lectures invite a tremendous amount of self-analysis. And I'm not talking about the ego function of looking at reality and gauging what is appropriate and what is not. I'm talking about what the guide names as self-punishment. To the place where you punish yourself for being who you are. That this has no conceivable advantage to you or to others. So when you read the lectures, you may not get, that may not be something that you stop on. This is something that I stopped on, that I had never fully understood in the way I feel that I understand it in this lecture. And that I understand this as a function of the ego being too invested in trying to match a cultural reality that I don't match. None of us match. If the society is full of blondes, I'm a brunette, I don't match. If the society is full of tall people and I'm short, I don't match. It really doesn't matter what it is. But everybody that I have ever known feels that there's some place within society or their morals or their spiritual belief system where they don't come up to, they don't make the grade. That they're not good enough. That may be true. And what the guide is saying here is that punishing yourself for that reality doesn't do you any good, and it doesn't do anyone else any good. That taking that effort and either recognizing the limitations and or seeing what you can do about them, that does have an advantage. So at another point in the lecture it talks about recognizing the imperfections of being a human being on the planet. And that in the simple recognition, it says you all have to accept your own imperfections as well as this life's imperfections. Before you can experience that absolute perfection is your destiny that you must ultimately realize. So in this part, what the guide is talking about is a larger sense of ego than an individual identity. That there's a place where we have an ego as a species. We have a concept of what a human being should be. And that if we don't meet that concept, we can spend time degrading ourselves instead of recognizing, no, we don't meet that concept. I wonder what that's about. And then if we go back and say, and our real selves are divine, how do these two come together? What is the paradox here? What is the contradiction here? If we are creation and nature, what is this perception that we have that we are not enough? And that by coming to peace with this, we actually find our real self. So does anybody have any questions at this point about the ego concepts in the lectures?
Yeah, and I was reading in this chapter I told you about, and it had a statement here. I don't think you've used this term, but it talks about the realization of the separate ego existence is an illusion, constitutes an extremely important step in the evolution of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Separate ego, what does he mean by that? Separate ego existence. The ego is split or something, huh?
Well, let me describe something that might help. I have referenced before the idea, there's a teaching that talks about 3 different spheres.
Uh-huh.
Okay? The individual self-sphere, the universal self-sphere,
okay,
and the God sphere. And this is from the 50-50 teaching. And what this refers to is there's a place where I see the world from my viewpoint, and I do not truly understand your viewpoint. So when I only speak from me, I see me as separate from you.
okay,
But when I speak from the universal self-sphere, I have a chance to see both you and me. So,
I get that.
right. So you have an ego, and I have an ego. And then we have an ego. And this is what I meant when I talked about the human beings as a species have an ego. Human beings as a species have a concept, even though it might be in little tiny cultural fragments. But the human species as a whole has some very similar ideas about what people should be like.
Uh-huh.
Well, when you break off into your own ego place, to some extent you are separating from the rest of us, and you will be limited on what you can learn. And I think that might be what that lecture is talking about. Separate ego place, rather than ego as a function that all of us can participate in.
So that makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ann?
Yes.
This is Lou. I have one question, and it relates to lecture number 158.
Okay.
Which was referred.
And then we have an ego. And this is what I meant when I talked about the human beings as a species have an ego. Human beings as a species have a concept, even though it might be in little tiny cultural fragments. But the human species as a whole has some very similar ideas about what people should be like.
Uh-huh.
Well, when you break off into your own ego place, to some extent you are separating from the rest of us, and you will be limited on what you can learn. And I think that that might be what that lecture is talking about. Separate ego place, rather than ego as a function that all of us can participate in.
So that makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jen,
Yes.
this is Lou. I have one question, and it relates to lecture number 158.
Okay.
This was referred to in your list.
Mm-hmm.
You started the discussion by talking about how the ego is kind of like almost like a computer. You know, it can memorize, it can learn, it can copy, and it can do all these things.
Mm-hmm.
But it cannot actually feel or deeply experience anything.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a function of the real self.
Right.
And on lecture 158, he mentions that feelings are an expression of the creative process itself, because feelings in the creative process are instant movements, which the lecture calls soul movements.
Uh-huh.
And I could follow until then, but then in the lecture, he proceeds to say that these soul movements, these inner movements, have their messages and signs that cannot be heeded too much if the individual is to effect self-realization and to establish contact with the real self. And that's where it confused me, because if these are inner movements and soul movements, we should, because heeding something means you pay attention to it. So it seems that almost the sentence got kind of like flipped around, that it should be in the affirmative, like they should be paid attention to.
Okay.
Self-realization. And the sentence in the lecture is that they cannot be heeded too much if we are to establish contact with the real self. And so that's the part that confused me a little bit.
So if you can imagine that not every feeling or impulse is mature.
Okay.
Okay?
Now I get you.
Right. So you want to allow the flow of creativity and feeling without presuming that it's an end-all and be-all in itself. And there's a process of being complete where we have the creative impulse and we put it out and our ego interacts with it, and real life interacts with it. And as it matures and formulates and comes back in, it really reactivates our real self, or joins with our real self. So it is not that it is separate, but a feeling in and of itself may not be enough for us to understand. Life actually has a purpose. So if we feel a creative movement going out, it needs to go out, it needs to manifest, we need to see the pluses and minuses, we need to understand our distortions and flaws, which are part of our real self, and interact with that and perhaps mature and release some of our distortions, and then allow that feeling to come back in a cleaner state. Now, I know you said you got the answer to your question, but I couldn't help it. I wanted to finish my sentence.
As soon as you mentioned not every feeling is mature, I got it.
Okay.
Because in my mind, I was thinking of soul movement, because, that's such a kind of like a poetic term, soul movement.
Yeah.
I was only thinking about it as being, good, mature feelings. I wasn't thinking of the maturity of some of our feelings, which is very true. If you have mature and immature feelings, you can't see them too much, but they might lead you in the wrong path too.
Right. And I want to differentiate between good and mature.
Mm-hmm.
The soul movement can be good. It can be essentially your real self expressing itself. Maturity is a different story.
That's right.
So it is learning to activate and keep the life flow moving forward so that you can weed out the immature or distorted parts of your real self. That's the process of living. But there's a distinction between the process of living and judging something as bad or wrong. So by saying something is mature or immature, you're only commenting on its developmental phase. That's all. You're not saying it's wrong or bad. You are saying, I think there's more. And we're allowed to want more. So there's a place where the guide very often describes life on this planet as being in a laboratory where we are, and he uses the words over and over again, we are transforming and purifying. Now, I can get really gross sometimes, so you throw up and you realize what you've done and you address the issue so you don't throw up again. So there's a place of throwing up and purging out things from inside yourself so that you can look through it and examine it. It's not that they're bad, but they're certainly not finished or developed to the place where you don't need to work on them in this environment. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense.
So in lecture 158, it goes into, like I say, the name of it again. If you read the names of the lectures, which by the way are different in the edited versions and the unedited versions, so there are sometimes 3 different titles for a lecture. You can get confused by this sometimes. So they might have named it something in the 1960s, and then they renamed it in the 1990s, and then they might have renamed it again because the guy did not put a billboard up saying this is the title. The title was deduced from the material. And as we re-emphasize things, we might change the whoever titles these things, sometimes change the flavor of the title. But in lecture 158, which you were referring to, the title is The Ego's Cooperation with or Obstruction to the Real Self. So it talks about how the ego can assist or obstruct the real self. And it goes on to talk about the fear of pleasure, the fear of letting go, because the ego can't fully participate in pleasure. If pleasure comes from the real self rather than from the ego, then for the organism to truly feel pleasure, the ego needs to let go. And the ego may feel like that is death. And there's we've grown up on this planet with survival instincts, where we have learned how to keep our body safe, we have learned how to keep our psyche safe, and we have learned how to keep our social status safe. We've learned how to not be made to look foolish. And to some extent, realizing that we are foolish can feel like a death of the image we've created, that we're not foolish. And this is what I mean by ego death, where the ego needs to unplug and change direction and come around and see things from a different perception. And it may be hard for the ego to do that. It is not hard for the real self to do that. Because the real self is creation. The real self is nature itself. The real self simply says, wow! I found something more true than I knew about before. But the ego may find that it had developed coping mechanisms for one level of interaction with reality. And on this new, let's say it's a wiser, more spiritual, more enlightened level of functioning, the ego may not feel that it has the tools to interact. So the ego may feel incompetent even as the organism is growing and maturing. And that this is a struggle within us. This is where the ego's function needs to keep changing and adjusting to keep up with us. So that was just a spin-off on your question. I do spin-off sometimes. So were there any other questions? Well, I have some more materials. I was just checking in. So in terms of the ego function, and I'm going to go on and just mention some other lectures, because if you may have gotten all you needed about the overall function of the ego. And then as I went through and researched this and found these other lectures, which I thought were fun, Lecture 161 talks about the unconscious negativity that endangers the surrender of the ego to the involuntary processes. So I'm going to repeat that. Unconscious negativity endangers the surrender of the ego to involuntary processes. And in that lecture, the guide talks about where the ego is so afraid of letting go that it will not let its guard down. That the ego feels change is on the way, and the ego does not know how to handle it. So the ego becomes hyperactive, hypervigilant. And one of the guide lists some symptoms of an overactive ego. And one is that it prevents sleep, because the ego does not want rest from tensions and chores. It wants to stay alert. It wants to stay on top of these tensions and chores, because if it doesn't, they could wash away or shift and the ego wouldn't know where it was. That an overactive ego prevents mutual involvement and love. Now that's interesting, because the ego might think that a relationship would be a wonderful thing, but true involvement and love involves total acceptance of and transcending goodwill towards another human being. To some extent, when you are in a relationship with someone, you need to let go of a tight grip you might have on former thought process or ideals or concepts, and really come to an understanding and knowing of who that person is, and an appreciation of who they are, even if they got there from a direction that you didn't get there from. I hope that makes sense. So let me repeat this. That an overactive ego can prevent mutual involvement and love, because it cannot accept and transcend into goodwill. And the last thing that the guide lists is that an overactive ego can actually prevent deep, profound meditation. Because deep, profound meditation is a place where you release and let go, and to see if you can allow the divine to enter. Now, except for helping you not fall asleep or sit up straight, what does the ego have to do in such a situation? It is, in effect, out of a job. In the moment where you are connected to the divine, the ego itself has nothing to do. Its job is done. So you can see where if you have an ego that's overly invested and wants things to do, it could actually prevent you from reaching out to such a divine place, such as love, such as meditation, or even something as simple as a deep, restful night's sleep.
Jan,
Yes.
Would an overactive ego be the same as an overdeveloped ego?
more than likely.
And if one realized that maybe that's what they had,
I learned a lot from these lectures. I think I have sometimes a very overdeveloped ego, so yes, I understand your question. So
You're not alone.
okay. I can identify.
So keep that sense of humor, okay? The guide says you have to have a sense of humor to do this work. You've got to be able to laugh, okay? You overshot the mark. Well, do it again. You know, redevelop it, re-look at it. Pick yourself up by the scruff of the neck and say, okay, we didn't do it that time, but we're going to do it again the next time. We'll get there. We'll practice. Mm-hmm. So the joke is that we call it a spiritual practice because we need to practice. And in a place of real love for ourselves, if we didn't have to practice, if we could do it right the first time, we'd be done. And we really wouldn't be focusing on it, right? So that this... go ahead.
The idea that something around embracing our imperfections is comforting. Mm-hmm. That I guess if we can see that we are not perfect and don't have to keep striving. I mean, of course, we're always striving to be better, but to realize that where we are, it's okay in our imperfections.
Yeah,
it's comforting.
And that acceptance can feel like a giving up. So again, as you grow up as a child, you learn to hang on. You learn to hold on to ways of doing things. You learn to hold on to memory. You learn to hold on to learning a sequence of events. And this is a really good illustration of what the guide is saying, is you grow up and you learn to hold on to everything so that one day you can throw it all away and let it go. And really understand that all this holding on and all this learning and all this stress and strain and work was so that you could develop an ego that could act as a container to let you release. So that you could, with a mature mind, truly appreciate your real self. So the difference between an infant and an adult is that the infant is not self-aware of its real self. And so what we're reaching for is what we had, but we have to go on a journey to regain that, but with the addition of consciousness and awareness. And basically, we need to forget what some parts of the journey. So yes, if you have an overdeveloped ego, you've done a great job. You've got an ego, and you're aware of it. There's a huge positive to that, because if you aren't aware of it, how are you going to relax it? How are you going to pare it down? It is awareness that allows us to really be responsible for our lives. A child cannot be responsible for its life because it is not aware. So from a spiritual perspective, we spend our whole lives becoming aware so that we can really appreciate who we have always been. And hopefully offer that understanding to the other as well. So it's at the hour, and I need to change a tape. So if you'll excuse me 1 second, I'm going to turn off the recording and change tape, and I'll be right back. So I'm willing to go into discussion of any of the points in the lecture. To some degree, I may have covered the function of the ego. So I don't mind what the discussion is about, and I am willing to accept that we may be done. And somebody told me to remember to say this is part 2 of the function of the ego, January 17th, 2009, because when they're playing the audio tapes in their car, they can't figure out what the second half belongs to. So there we go. Hopefully I've settled that for them. So is there any discussion that you'd like to have about this? And by that I mean that it's not necessarily a question so much as something that you're working with or on that you'd like to share with the group.
I've got something. This is Wendy here.
Oh, hello, Wendy.
Hi. Can anyone truly know all of another person? Someone has just brought that up, that they are so overdeveloped that no one can know them all. But yeah, I'd just like your view on that.
Rather than my giving you a personal opinion, I'm going to reference the guide. So in lecture 180, which is the spiritual meaning of relationship, the guide, and I'm embarrassed to paraphrase because I don't have a memory for precise wording, but what the guide says is, how could you ever be bored with someone because there is no end to knowing them? So even though in the way you phrased it, it sounds like the person might have been saying it slightly arrogantly, it may still be true. But it may still be true. That it would, since we do not know ourselves totally, it would naturally follow that we do not know another person totally. And whether somebody says something in arrogance or in truth, it doesn't change the fact that they may be right. But I would challenge that, I would challenge why a spirit would come here who was so highly developed that they didn't need the rest of us. I would be curious about that spiritual journey. Does that respond a bit to your question?
Yeah, I mean, I said I didn't think anyone ever truly knew anyone.
Mm-hmm.
But there was I think that I don't think anyone truly knows anyone else, but that that there's an intimacy, that person is probably after an intimacy through knowing, whereas I think they're looking in the wrong direction.
Mm.
No?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Tell us from your thoughts, Dan, why would somebody's life, why would somebody be here if it's no life path is to know another without first knowing, him or herself? So it seems that the question begs the follow-up question, which would be, it seems that the life path is to first concern ourselves with ourselves, and in the process of loving, share ourselves with others.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a, in terms of a push and pull.
Yeah, yeah.
It's more of a push process than a pull process.
Mm-hmm. And keeping in mind that every person on the planet is working out distortions. So you can be a very developed being and you're still working out distortions. There's...
It would be a distraction. Like instead of focusing on myself, I need to know somebody else fully. And I don't even know myself fully.
Yes, it can be a distraction. Okay. However, learning another person teaches us about ourselves.
Sure. That's the brotherhood. That's the spiritual principle of brotherhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's always a negative version as well as a positive version of everything. There's negativity in love and there's positive in love. Okay? Or you can put negativity into love, and you can put positive intention into love. So in the push-pull, in the knowing of another person, you can reach out to another person almost in a codependent manner. Because you're not able, you have an underdeveloped ego, and you're not able to see yourself. But you can manage to see a bit more deeply when focused on the other person. So the way that's described in the lectures is that's simply where the pendulum is. That you may spend an entire lifetime on one end of a spectrum. Not because that's all there is, and not because it's right or wrong, but that's where you're working. My experience is, I didn't know quite how to phrase that. I have opinions, I have many opinions, but when I work with people, I try to back off and see a larger point of view. And what I see when I pull back is I see more and more people learning many things in a single lifetime compared to the stories that I've been told and that I read about in the literature, in the history, and so forth. And that there may be a quickening, a spiritual quickening on the planet where we do more things in one lifetime than perhaps we used to do. So in other words, when you live on a farm and you only know 10 people in your whole life and you spend your whole life out in the fields working the farm, I'm not saying you can't be a wise and enlightened person from that. But when you are living a modern life and you've got 4 or 5 different professions in a single lifetime and several relationships, and you're moving rapidly through various social stages, that you may be interacting more because you're in different phases of learning. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense.
Yes. And it makes sense that the material became easier. If you compare centuries ago, the material was much, much harder.
Mm-hmm.
It was easier to spend a whole lifetime entrapped into the material side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's such a struggle.
And from a positive...
Now you conquer that, and then you go like, well, you know, I did that. Still doesn't feel, you know, I still don't feel happy. So what else is there?
Mm-hmm. So if we take that and we analogize it to a modern life, I know a lot of people who spend 20 years doing something, and then their life speeds up rapidly, and they do 2 years of this and 2 years of that and 2 years of the other. And it's kind of curious, how could I have spent 20 years doing something? And now I move from place to place or job to job every 2 years. Well, there was a learning, a base being built that you're now taking advantage of. That other lifetimes could be, in the positive sense, a base from which we're working, where we needed an entire lifetime to learn a lesson, and we don't need an entire lifetime to review that lesson again. So what I'm offering is this, and several questions in a row have touched in on this. I find it useful as a spiritual practice when I feel something negative to find a positive version of it, so that I'm seeing a more rounded picture. So for instance, when the question was asked, if somebody says, I'm so complicated you couldn't possibly understand me, I think, what's the positive of that? Yes, yes, you are. You are so complicated. You and every other person on the planet. You may be slightly more complicated, but there isn't anybody so uncomplicated that I could know all of who they are. You're simply expressing a range. But there's truth in what you say. So another way of saying that is I try to find the grain of truth in what people tell me, rather than focusing on where they might be in distortion or they might be on one side of a spectrum. Their view from that end of the spectrum could still contain truth. And when I key in to their truth, it helps me to be a part, or to feel like like I'm sharing a part of their experience rather than standing off and judging. Does that make sense? So in this discussion of we live perhaps quicker lives than people used to, I try to remove any inclination on my part to make that better than or me good, them bad. Just like I would not judge a 3-year-old who needed to spend all day learning how to balance their cup of milk. I wouldn't judge that being as less developed on a spiritual level. That's simply their developmental phase. I was there, but I'm not there now. And that being will move along rapidly or slowly, depending on their needs. And I may not want to spend my entire day or week with a 3-year-old. That may not be what I want to do. Rather than judge them, to simply notice that I'm in a different developmental phase. I think I kind of went off on a tangent there, but maybe not.
That's good, thanks, Jan. It's Wendy again. If anyone else hasn't got a question, I've got another thing that came up for me, in that you said that an overactive ego prevents deep, profound meditation, but to some extent the male active principle, if the male has more active principle in them, meditation isn't going to work as well for them as for a female. So what's the best alternative to meditation for a male?
Well, I'm going to tease you about that, because what you're saying is that Gandhi couldn't relax and meditate. So I don't think it's I don't think that the fact that men tend to specialize or focus more of their life energy in the active principle as meaning that they cannot meditate. But I also, and this is again, it's my personal spiritual practice of saying, where have I decided, and I'm going to take your statement, I'm going to take it and express it in an I statement from myself. Okay, so I'm not judging you, but it's easier for me to communicate if I say it from I. Why do I think that meditation in this format is superior to meditation in that format? So the question itself may carry an assumption. Okay? Number one, that person's task is to learn to meditate when it may not be their task. So a person who is infused with the active principle, as if on a spiritual level they've got ADH, that whatever that acronym is for attention deficiency syndrome. Okay? A spirit may get born on the planet with that kind of hyperactive, inability to relax. But if you go back far enough, the question would be, why? Why did that spirit choose that degree of active energy? And the only answer that I can come up with from a spiritual perspective is they needed it. Either they needed it to find something, or they needed to learn to conquer it. Does that make sense? So you speak of a man has more of the active principle. That may be true, but that doesn't mean a man can't relax. It may mean that a man's task on this planet may have less to do with meditation than with manifesting. Okay? That may be true. But for an individual man in an individual circumstance, it is difficult to judge what is appropriate for them in their development. And what I'm trying to build here, and it's a little clumsy, I hope it makes sense, what I'm trying to suggest here is that when you say generically, You can say males have more of the active principle and women have more of the receptive principle. But on an individual basis and level, that's not true 24/7. That everyone has a variety of active and receptive. So I'm curious if you're willing, without necessarily being personal, and certainly without, bringing somebody else in who might not appreciate it, can you flesh out a little bit more about what your question might be about?
Okay, it was just that in conversation with a male, he actually said that it's a feminine thing to meditate. It doesn't work for males. Males have a different way of relating to their higher self. But he didn't actually explain to me in a detail that I can understand how a male works in relationship with the higher self.
Okay, I'd like to give you an example.
Is that enough?
Yeah, I'd like to give you an example. I personally do not meditate. And I felt guilty about this. You can imagine I'm in this spiritual practice and I'm doing years and years and years of work and I'm doing helpership and everybody's talking about meditation and I'm feeling guilty as sin because I never sit and meditate. That's not what I do. And then one day I realized that there was an activity. In fact, there are several activities that I do where I'm going to call it zoning out. I don't mean falling asleep. I don't mean going unconscious. But there are several activities that I do where my mind becomes free. And I began to notice. I began to notice that when I'm doing many, many things, sometimes that, oddly enough, allows me to release my mind and go into a thought process. Now, this is one of them. It's a minor example. But for some of us, we meditate when we're driving. If we have a regular long commute where your ego takes over the moment-to-moment, turn left, turn right, put on the brakes, and you go into an automatic driving mode, it's very common experience to arrive at your destination and not remember specifically, moment by moment, how you got there, especially if you've gone on that route many, many times. What if this is another form of meditation? So what I'm suggesting is that what he says may be true. It may also be a defense. I have no way of knowing.
It seems that it's just a defense because if you look historically, all the hermits, traditionally the monks, the gurus, the people who go off on a path of detachment from the material world and go off in isolation to live a life of meditation, sometimes prayer and meditation. These have been quintessentially male figures. I mean, Buddha was a male.
Yes.
So just looking at history, the figure of female meditators is quite recent. I mean, unless you became like a nun, but then it was more related to prayer, really, and then service, and really meditation. So I think history doesn't even, I think it was just looking for a defense because history doesn't even seem to support that. There's an interesting article by Ken Wilber about that, about how actually it's the other way around, about the traditional meditation path. It was designed for males and how maybe for women it needs to be a little different because women need to be a little bit more engaged in the world. So it's interesting how he makes exactly the opposite arguments than your friend was making.
Well,
it's very interesting.
Yeah. For instance, do women meditate when they knit? Is it possible that women have simply learned to accommodate the needs of the real world in a way where they can zone out quietly with their minds and yet accomplish something? So I'm agreeing with your talking about men may go off and do it for a living, but women may do it day in and day out. And what I'm suggesting is, rather than judge that, to notice that there are differences. And those differences can add up to the place where you say men follow the active principle in acting to go off and do it as a profession. And women may be receptive in the place where they acquiesce to the needs of their families. And they don't go off and meditate, but they find little places where they can meditate quietly during the day. So I'm inviting a deeper understanding of the cliches.
Thanks. That's actually what I wanted. I wanted to have get some other views on it.
Mm-hmm. So are there any other thoughts or contributions that anyone would like to make?
Then I have a question, since we're on the topic of meditation. Do you have, in your experience, do you have any sort of meditation that you found particularly helpful? Like, it seems that guided meditation wouldn't be very helpful for this kind of work.
There's a very famous meditation in the lectures. There's 3 lectures on meditation. But the one that's interesting, and it's interesting because people can wrestle with it a little bit. You don't have to just zone out and hope that you reach God. In this particular moment, my mind's gone blank. It's either 182 or 183. And it is nicknamed the 3 voices. Okay? And when it's taught, what we use is we use 3 chairs. And the meditation suggests, the lecture suggests that there's a way of meditating where you sit on one chair, or even if you have a long couch, you can have different places on the couch. And you just kind of have to know that this end is this voice, and that end is that voice, and the middle is the middle voice. But that you gain an appreciation for the different voices that are coming into your consciousness, and give them a container and a space, and listen to them. That this is a form of meditation. So like I say, the nickname is called Meditation for 3 Voices. And it invites you to hear, for instance, and you can listen to any 3 voices you want, but the lecture specifically talks about listening to the destructive child and the adult ego and the real self. And to hear that you have conflicting points of view in you, but to allow space for those points of view to be heard. And what the guide is suggesting is that is a form of meditation. Because after all, what is meditation except trying to access the divine, right? And aren't we divine? And if we are divine, is not our destructive, egotistical child divine? As well as our adult ego? So that by listening to the different voices inside yourself, you can become more attuned to the core of your real self. So that is a form of meditation proposed by the guide that is very, very active. It's a little bouncy. So sometimes when I teach higher self, lower self, and mask, I do the same thing. It's kind of fun if you pick a red cushion for the lower self and a gold cushion for the higher self, and so forth. But there's a place of sitting in that energy and trying to access and speak from that voice that brings up things you may not have heard before on a conscious level. It's useful. So pathwork meditation is not Buddhist meditation. And by that I'm not in any way trying to diminish it, but it's not sitting on a cushion and zoning out. And the Buddhists have walking meditations. and many, many other spiritual practices have ways of meditating where you do engage the motor system of the body. And it's useful to do so because then you have less to think about. So if I go on for a second, that's what I mean by, depending on your personality and your situation, your circumstances, you may be doing more meditating than you realize when you are driving a car. That by utilizing your conscious ego functions and keeping them busy, you may actually have a capacity to hear and talk to your real self. Does that make sense? So I'd like to suggest that you read the Meditation for Three Voices. It says Meditation 182 or 183. And see what you think about that. And see if by listening to these voices, you might find a different way of being with yourself and accessing your divine nature, which is, again, the purpose of meditation. And the method by which you do that can be entirely personal. For some people, riding a bike, when you're riding 50 miles on a bike, you're not totally conscious of every single second of that journey. So there's a lot of time when your body may be, sorry, not your body, where your mind, your ego mind, may be very, very busy keeping balance, watching the road, checking for traffic, watching for stones in the road, permitting a part of you to be quiet and peaceful. And long walks can be the same way. And so the pathwork meditations tend to be somewhat active. Pathwork meditation tends to be more about accessing voices within you than about stillness.
I found it, and it's lecture 182.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm embarrassed sometimes when at least I came close. Sometimes I'm 100.
And you were very close.
Okay.
You were very close. Impressive.
Well, when you're 70 lectures off, it's embarrassing, but only one. I can appreciate that. Anyone else want to contribute something? Well, I'm learning that an hour and a half is really a good time period for these presentations and discussions. So we'll go ahead and let this go. Thank you very much for participating. I enjoy them very much. I hope you do. The next one I'm going to do is going to be on lecture 248, which is, and I don't know why I can't seem to get the title right. It's not the three principles of evil. It's the personification of evil on three principles. I'm probably not even saying it right then, but it's an interesting lecture and I'm fascinated by it. So I don't think it's glum or negative in any way. It's a fascinating, different way of looking at negativity. So I hope you join me then. And thank you very much for participating. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
And
No worries.
thank you, Jan.
Okay. Bye-bye.
And bye.
Be still and know that I am God, that I am with you. Be still and feel not sing.